Okay, we've made a film about Eisenstein, and I have to tell you a very cruel anecdote about Rotterdam and Eisenstein, which also appears in the film. In 1929, Eisenstein was on his way to make a film, surprisingly, in Hollywood. And he stopped off in Rotterdam. He came down in a small plane. I think he came from Berlin. I don't think Rotterdam Airport is in the same place then in 1929 it is here. But there was a huge, huge crowd of journalists waiting to receive the aircraft. And when he finally came out of the aircraft, all the journalists' faces fell. They were all disappointed. They were expecting Einstein, not Eisenstein. I say that because, I wonder how many people actually know who Eisenstein is or was. For me, and I think for cinema history, he probably was, for me, well, certainly for me, it's a very subjective opinion, but he was the greatest film director we've ever had. Cinema begins in 1895. We're now 2015, so that means we've had 120 years of cinema. And I don't know what you think about cinema history, but although there have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of film directors, I think there are very, very few really amazing, visionary directors. And I think the greatest period of cinema history was probably the 1920s. It's the end of the silent period before the beginning of sound cinema. Charlie Chaplin and Eisenstein thought the worst thing that could happen to cinema was the advent of sound. Because suddenly people stopped looking at pictures, and began to rely on text as the ways and means to understand cinema. And I sincerely believe, we do have a text-based cinema. Cinema always goes back to the bookshop for its stories, its narratives, and its plots. I think in the last 15 years, one of the big events in world cinema, for Christ's sake, are Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And you can go down to the marketplace and you can buy the original books, certainly of Harry Potter and certainly of Lord of the Rings. So I think there's always been, I can say that very easily about those two phenomena, which are very contemporary, very ubiquitous, but there's a way, whoever you choose, whether your fantasies are about Spielberg, whether they're about Scorsese, Almodovar, Godard, you name it, every single film you've ever seen started life with a text, which I think is a great disappointment, because that means that cinema is always connected to the bookshop. Text. I think there's a way that, what maybe Chaplin and certainly Eisenstein complained about that, because, it's like going, to the Rice Museum or the Stedelijk or the Louvre in Paris. And you can see people walking along the paintings, and they look at the paintings in a very puzzled way and wonder what they're about, even though they might be, figurative paintings by Leonardo da Vinci or abstract paintings by Mondrian. And then they bend forward and they look at the caption under the painting, and it says, "Lady in a red hat." And they think, oh, yes, that's what it's about. And then they forget the painting and move on to the next one. So you see how they need a literary text to explain what their eyes can see anyway. So from that reasoning, I think most people are visually illiterate. Most people don't know what pictures are about, don't know and understand what's going on, can't in any particular way reproduce those notions of imagery with their own intelligence. You know how it happens when you go to school. Your teacher, when you're about, 10, 11 or 12, says, put away the crayons, put away the paint, put away the easel. You've got to get serious now. If you're going to pay the rent and pay Albert Heijn, you're going to have to learn text. Pictures aren't going to be very valuable to you. And we all live now, don't we, to 80, certainly in this country, 85. Men obviously live longer than, women live longer than men, because grandmas are far more important than grandfathers. I'm looking at you. You can push the notion of the cradle, but does that mean very much? And there's a feeling, I suppose, that if we all live to 85, and you lose the interest in imagery as a child when you're 10, That means 70 years when you have virtually nothing to do with the consideration of visual imagery, either making it or looking at it, which seems to be very impoverishing. And I think Eisenstein knew this way back in the 1920s, greatest maybe period of filmmaking, before we had to rely on text to understand what we were looking at. And I would like to think that the film I've made is very much a response to this notion of the prioritizing of the image over the banal uses of text. There is a way, of course, that we should think of Eisenstein certainly as being Soviet, certainly being Russian, and both Lenin and Marx knew that maybe the best way to put over their propaganda was through images, because most of Russia, all the way from Moscow to Vladivostok, all across Siberia, north and south, biggest country in the world, most of the people were illiterate. They could not read and they could not write. Russian Revolution tried very hard to put that right, but in the beginning, Stalin certainly thought that making propaganda by images was a very, very good thing. And he employed people like Dozhenko and Padovkin and Bertov, and certainly Eisenstein, to make very much propaganda films. But I don't think we ever really think of these films anymore as propaganda, because I suppose, I mean, who do we think of? If you think of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, as propaganda for Roman Catholicism. But do we think of it as propaganda? I don't think so. Very, very good propaganda makes very, very, very good art, and very, very good art makes very, very good living. And I'm quite convinced that Eisenstein knew and understand this. In 1929, Stalin suggested he should go indeed to Hollywood to learn about sound cinema. I don't think Eisenstein learned very much. He wasn't really very interested in sound cinema. But there is a way that he brought with him this extraordinary sort of montage theory ideas about association. He wasn't particularly interested in telling stories. He wanted to make extraordinary images which were relative, I suppose, to a notion of civilization. But when he was abroad, and he was abroad from 1929 to 1931, I think when we're all abroad, there's a way we begin to lose some of our, I suppose, conservatism. We become different people. Don't you all think you're different people when you're abroad from when you're at home? And he opened up to all sorts of activities, both personal and private. Eisenstein made three extraordinary films at the beginning of his life. One's called Strike, another one's called Battleship Potemkin, and the third is called October. At the very, very end of his life, he made three more films. First one's Alexander Nevsky, then Ivan the Terrible and the Boy's Plot. And the first three films are about general ideas, about people en masse, associated again with propaganda. And the last three films are about personal relationships. And I've often wondered, and I've been studying Eisenstein all my career, so since probably the early 1960s until now, and I've often wondered why that was. And I think it was because he left Russia for 3 years, became a foreigner, began to look at Western ideas from a completely different point of view, was away from Stalin, was away from those ideas of material, what's the phrase? Those notions, should we say, of collectivization, dialectical materialism. I have no idea what dialectical materialism is, and I'm sure you haven't. You know, it's like those words like postmodernism. I never know what postmodernism means, and if you're in difficulty, you always rather pompously talk about these things as though you pretend to know about them. But away from home, he, I think, opened up in all sorts of ways. And this film probably is an example of that. He was very interested in the very beginning of life, which the Greeks called eros, and the very ending of life, which is called thanatos. And I'm sure, you know, there are 7 billion people in the world, and all those 7 people, the most two important things in their life is not even their birth, but is their creation, the very beginnings of their life, and of course, at the very, very end, their death. And most art, and certainly most cinema, is about the very beginnings and the very ends, which are basically non-negotiable. Everything else is negotiable, apart from the very beginning and the very end. If you tread your mind back through the last 10 films you've seen, I bet you most of those films will include 2 items. 2 people fucking, and I'm sorry, 2 people dying. This little audience here, I know very well that 2 people fuck to make you, and I'm sorry, you're all going to die. So no wonder that these are the most important subject matters, I think, that cinema in general, and probably of all art in general. Now, I don't want you to feel too despondent, and I would like you very much to see this film as being jubilant and positive. It's full of a certain sort of tragedies, but it's also represented indeed of a very, very human filmmaker who probably, I believe, is the greatest filmmaker we've ever seen, but also was very, very, very much a human being who we can all identify with. Please enjoy the film. Thank you.
Because he's the greatest filmmaker ever. That's
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think he was well positioned because he was working in the 1920s, where everybody was trying to find out what cinema was. That means, overground entertainment cinema, as represented by Griffith's Birth of a Nation, but also underground cinema, as represented by somebody like Buñuel and Dali within Chenin de Lou.
Can you explain why he is the greatest?
Well, I think, there's a way, I think Bazin, famous French film apologist in the 1930s, said that film is a combination of literature, of the theatre, and if you're very, very lucky, some painting. And there's a way that still, maybe even in 2015, cinema still hasn't worked itself out. It can still be very easily deconstructed back into those 3 phenomena. But there is a way with everybody in the 1920s looking for finding out what is cinema. What the fuck is cinema? How do we make good cinema? The experiments were many, many, many and multivarious, but I sincerely believe that Eisenstein was the person who had the best idea. And I seriously think, maybe this is vainglorious because I'm trained in the British film industry as a film editor, it was his particular strength of being able to organize everything, be able to point to you, to make cross-referencing, to make a very big associational relationship between all the various threads, the pictures, the color, the artistry, the music, the use of language, etc., to bring it all together.
We get it.
And we get that, because probably...
Let me another question.
Shut up a minute. There is a way that, we take a certain sort of cinema for granted. But I think we really do have to imagine that this was the first man who really put it all together.
Okay.
You can speak now.
Okay. You mentioned the word fuck. There is a lot of sex in the movie. How important is that for you?
Isn't sex important for your life?
Absolutely, but how important is it for you that it's in the movie?
Well, I think, there's a way... It's a bit symbolic, too. The erect prick that fell away. I think, our sexuality, certainly our first sexual experiences are always very, very important. And I think it's particularly true, with the notions, shall we say, of cultural activity. And I think, sexual happiness, sexual satisfaction, sense whether masculine or female, of, producing in a sense or being in a position. I often thought, the only reason we exist is basically to fuck. That's to put very vulgarly, but whether you're a zebra, a flea, a human being, or an ape, we are obliged, almost against our will, to reproduce. That's the only thing, in a curious way, is to keep that continuity going. And I think in some ways, if we can't satisfy that, we are somehow incomplete. And whether indeed you're a policeman or an artist or Prime Minister of Great Britain, all these things are very, very important. And I think, the very beginning, as I suggested before, and the very, very end are the only parameters we have. Everything else could be negotiable, but you can't move away from these 2 essentials of your beginning and your ending. Okay. I think generally in my cinema is about that, and I think we tried to make it certainly relevant to Eisenstein.
Okay. You show Eisenstein in a essential moment in his life, as we understand of the movie, when he was in Mexico, and losing his homosexual virginity, so to speak. That is a very important thing in his life. How historical truth is it, or doesn't it matter for you, that the historical truth?
You know, we've created a number of conversations between Eisenstein in Mexico and Pera Atasheva, his secretary, who desperately loved the man who is back in cold, freezing Moscow. The actual correspondence was conducted by letter. I felt that it was much more immediate to turn this into a telephone conversation. And if you want to read about all the facts, you can go to Moscow and you can find the archives and you can read this long correspondence where indeed the intimacy between these two people, Pera Atasheva and Eisenstein, is writ large, and he told her everything. And I'm prepared to believe that that correspondence is true and faithful because it was offered so intimately and so emotionally, and gives me, I really believe, the license to be able to construct this story in this way.
Yeah, but you are going a little bit further, because you said, well, the Eisenstein after Mexico is the other person than the Eisenstein before Mexico.
That is because of his emotional experiences. You know, these 10 days were really traumatic. You can see how he was certainly interested, maybe intellectually, in the House of the Dead, the Museum of the Dead, but then that child who actually is all recorded in these letters, you can find them in archives in Moscow, actually died or was already dead in his arms. And if you look at his films, there are constant references to the question of having children, bringing children up, and the notions of fatherhood and parenthood. And I think we have sufficient information to suggest indeed that what we organized in this film has a very serious element of truth. Let me also ask you this. There is no such thing as history, there's only historians. And most history is about mythology and not really about history. And I sincerely also believe most writers are liars. Just take all the historians that you can think of, from the ancient Romans right up to Sir Winston Churchill. And the best historians are those who write the best stories, and that's what we believe in. And I also think that in a curious way, if you think the best stories are written by the best historians, then in a curious way, history is only a branch of literature.
Okay, but wasn't in Einstein's life not very important that when he came back to the Soviet Union, that the Stalinist repression was growing and growing? Was that not more important? Was Stalin not more important in his life than the fact that he fucked in Mexico?
Well, let's say they were both important. There is a way that Eisenstein reckoned there were 6 people who were very important for his emotional development. It starts with his father, who was a tyrannical oligarch and didn't really think very importantly of his son. I suppose the next person would be, Lenin, who laid down programs of how to live, how to behave, what your, moral position should be. Then along came Stalin, who really couldn't care less about notions of communism and was interested in personal tyranny. He certainly provided the opportunities for Eisenstein to practice, but there was enormous amounts of censorship, and he basically said, you only do what I want to do. There was a theater director called Meyerhold who taught Eisenstein everything he wanted to do, but Meyerhold ended up tortured and dead and killed by Stalin. Eisenstein was particularly interested in Da Vinci, who he somehow identified with. Da Vinci was a homosexual, various explained by Freud in terms of his homosexual behavior, so there was a big, association. Then another tyrant would be indeed Upton Sinclair, who provided him with the circumstances of making a film and then betrayed him. And then maybe even in a curious way, his great lover, Palomino Canedo, could again offered him huge opportunities, but ultimately the association, only 10 days long, was basically for eternity non-consummated. So I think these particular people, and I'm sure we could all find these sorts of people in our own lives, are responsible, in a sense, to provide him with the parameters of his life.
Okay, well, let's give the word to the audience. Are there any questions in the audience? Go ahead, please. Yeah.
First, thank you for the very good, great movie. Is it a silly question?
Kunt u de vraag horen?
Is it a silly question to ask if the celluloid of what he made in Mexico is still also in the archives of Moscow?
Yes, indeed. There's probably more than 250 miles. Sorry, let me repeat the question. The question is that does the footage of Que Viva Mexico still exist? And the answer is yes. It exists in the archives in California. A lot of it went back to Russia. Some of it found its way indeed to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, for example. And a whole series of people, Russians, Europeans, and certainly Mexicans, have tried to edit that film. But I think that Eisenstein's supreme achievement was he was an extraordinary editor. And I think all the films, and I have actually seen 10 various versions. One is called Thunder over Mexico, another one's called Smiles over Mexico City, etc. But they were all edited by people who did not have the particular talent that Eisenstein had to put the materials together. So it's my opinion, I share this opinion with very many other people, all the films that resulted were no more than Mexican travelogues. And I think the absolute essence of a particular genius, let me continue to repeat, about Eisenstein was his ability to put everything together. And what we've made here, in a sense, is a sort of homage. You can understand this film is highly, highly edited, very self-consciously edited, to tell you about, in a sense, the structure of formation, of vocabulary, and aesthetics of what I would describe as particularly cinema, cinema, cinema. This is not recorded theatre, it's not an illustrated book, it is arranged in a particular way which is deliberately both old and new, celluloid and the digital revolution, all about filmmaking.
Okay, maybe there are more questions. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so earlier today you were talking about cinema seeking its own identity. I can think about your movies, your earlier movies in the 80s. The role of music in your earlier movies, it was almost a protagonist. And now it's still very important. So that's one of my questions. How do you see music within your movies? The second question would be, of course, the cinematic importance of Eisenstein is quite important, but how was Guanajuato itself and the Mexican culture important and an inspiration for your this particular movie?
Okay, two questions. How important is music in my cinema? And what was it, I suspect, about the Mexican landscape, the Mexican attitude, and the notion of location was very important for this movie? Let me try to answer the second question first. I had never really thought about making ever a film about Eisenstein. I discovered him when I was an adolescent, about 17, without actually sitting down and, physically surrounded by books and doing the research. I never ever did that, but my whole career has always had an interest in this man. I've been to all the places in Russia and Mexico and certainly America and Europe where he's been. I think I've read everything in translation he ever wrote. And there are certainly 6 finished films and a lot of unfinished films, and I've seen them all. So I suppose I have made, without any particular desire to be an authority on Eisenstein, I know quite a lot about him. Then I think in the early 1990s, I started going to Mexico, film festivals, etc., retrospectives in Mexico City, and I discovered this extraordinary town, which is, as you can imagine, very photographic. I went there in the springtime, extremely beautiful, and it was also in some curious sort of time warp. We didn't have to bring in a big art department to get rid of the television aerials, for example. I think we've exaggerated some of the color, and you could do that with contemporary grading. But I think, if you went there tomorrow morning, you would find it very much as we found it. So in a sense, you could film it in last year, 2014, and there's a way you could make it work for the likes of people like Diego Rivera, who's actually born there, and certainly his wife Frida Kahlo. So that, I think, probably gives you some idea of your second question. First question, the music of this film is Prokofiev. And you probably know that he and Eisenstein collaborated on a film called Alexander Nevsky. This is 8 years after he had been to Mexico, and they'd had a previous relationship in various theatrical events. They tried to make a version of Cinderella together, for example, as an opera, which never ever happened. And there was always a particular relationship, and I used this with my long association with Michael Nyman. There's always a way that music somehow is a secondary adjunct to the picture making. You know how it works. You first of all shoot everything, and then halfway through the editing stage, you ring up a producer and you ask them, let's find some music. And you don't normally find a composer, you find somebody who writes music for cinema, who's not necessarily the same person. But there was a way that
Mr.
Eisenstein.
Sorry, but we have to speed up a little bit.
All right.
Because
Well, you shut up.
otherwise-
You shut up, and I'll give you a
other
water.
people will-
All right.
will-
So there's a particular relationship. Prokofiev promised not to write a single piece of music and Eisenstein promised not to frame a single frame until they'd arranged on a particular way of working. Michael Nyman and I had used this at the beginning for our early cinema, things like the Draftsman's Contract. So there was a particular way that these two people were very sympathetic about finding a particular way in which the music and indeed the image worked. I don't have the circumstances of making Alexander Nevsky here, but we deliberately used, I think, the First Symphony, his Fifth Symphony, Romeo and Juliet, Love of Three Oranges, to be able to construct the particular emotional environment, but also the structural environment to put this editing together.
Okay, I think there is a question over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah? I have three small questions.
Small question.
Yes, one small question.
I obviously, thanks to him, have to give you a small answer.
Are you allowed Russian Minister of Culture to censor your next film about Eisenstein?
Well, I think you would agree we have found an extraordinary actor to play Eisenstein. And I'm so encouraged with his abilities. We've written 2 more scripts, so we're going to make a trilogy. It's called Eisenstein Abroad. Film number 1 is about his experiences in the very first film festival in the world, which happened in Switzerland in 1929. Film number 2 is going to be called Eisenstein in Hollywood, which in a way is a curious oxymoron. Can you imagine this extraordinary poetic, amazingly inventive filmmaker actually working in the seat of commercial cinema? And then, of course, film number 3 is the one you've just seen.
You're not making a movie about Eisenstein in Holland. You know he was in Volendam and Marken, of all places.
Yeah, but you can see, and I've seen that footage, and it's very sweet and very beautiful. But you understood that other anecdote, which I mentioned before, that all these stupid journalists and film enthusiasts were waiting for Einstein and not Eisenstein. How much for sophistication in Holland about cinema?
You say that the life is determined by birth and death, but Eisenstein he also have some peculiarity with his health. As gossips were that he cannot get erection. And it's,
Well, I don't know where you've got that from. He certainly was diagnosed when he was about 8 years old of having a weak heart.
Yes,
he
then-
was always aware of that. And if a weak heart is related to blood pressure, and if blood pressure is essential to help you create an erection, then obviously your thesis is true. But I don't think the particular way you made it relevant would be curiously associated necessarily with his sexuality. And he did die, just as we suggested,
Yes, because-
aged quite early, 50 years old, and the circumstances apparently as recorded are as we have stated in the film. Very, very unfortunate death, because his friends apparently, for all sorts of reasons, maybe they were partying or drank too much vodka, never heard his cry for help.
Okay, are there more questions in the audience? Okay, well, there's one last question, please.
I was wondering why you didn't show us Eisenstein working in the film.
Well, I think, I don't know if you all heard that, the question is, why didn't I show Eisenstein working more? Well, of course, the question is, we do show him working. There are sequences out with the camera in the deserts of Mexico. There's an awful lot of talk and chat about the business of making films, about this argument that the Americans go on and on about rushes, about Californian laboratories, etc., etc. So the whole film business is there. But several years ago here in Holland, I made a film about Rembrandt, and I thought every Dutch person knew about Rembrandt, and I was remarkably surprised that most Dutch people know nothing at all about Rembrandt. But what was I going to do? Was I going to spend hours and hours and hours explaining to you who Eisenstein was, or was I going to plunge ahead to show you in a curious way the experiences of a man who could indeed have been a filmmaker, but maybe these experiences could happen to somebody else? And if you really, really wanted to do, you push a button on the internet and you find everything you want to know.
Okay, well, Mr. Greenaway, thank you very much for coming here. For all your explanations about the movie, and the audience, thank you very much for coming to the movie. And well, probably next year we're going to see the second Eisenstein movie.
Yes, I'm going to bore you with Eisenstein 1 and 2. You've seen it. Thank you.